It is quite a common assumption we all make, that the person next to us thinks and feels in some way analogous to how we think and feel. It's hard to imagine society functioning if we were afraid everyone had a totally different mind wiring and potentially may not understand us at all. However, we have no way to prove that it is true that the person next to you is similar to you inside. We just assume it. But what if there are human beings out there who are in every way human, but within, their minds are so radically different that if we were to peer into them, it would be absolutely alien. How could we ever hope to spot the strangers who walk among us? Through a small telescope, coated in a vintage bronze case, stared a searching eye, which sat in front of a concluded brain, which concealed a committed mind. In its sights sat a harassed-looking woman, poring over some papers and occasionally having brief conversations over the phone. Every now and again, another woman and a man would come into view, speak with the seated woman, and then go out of view once again. For the 1,000th time that hour, the mind, which was clothed in the brain, behind the eye, rehearsed its brief, which it had learned off by heart, verbatim. Primary lead, Private Investigator Mirren, formerly Police Officer Mirren. Secondary leads, assistants Barry and Matthews, former police officers Barry and Matthews. All are known associates of the primary target. Surveil and covertly pursue leads until you locate the target. Terminate leads as acceptable collateral damage. The 3 private investigators were investigating the activities of a delusional cult that had been plaguing the peripheries of society for centuries. As much as such groups were trivial to the mind, it was a notable event when the ignorant, the masses of the ruled, accidentally stumbled into the world that was hidden from them, even if that access and their understanding were extremely limited. As is often the case for the ignorant, their natures often lead them to unknowingly complicate the plans of the mind's master. This happened to be the case for these 3. The mind found itself anxious to know what words were being spoken. It felt a burn within, which it noted as an irregularity. The mind had long ago mastered the art of patience. It had, after all, stood entirely still upon a desert rock for just over 100 years, until its garments had rotted off its body and it had become mostly buried in sand and dust. Why then was it feeling so stirred when it had only been watching for a few hours? Perhaps the mind had leant too close into the body. Something that happened occasionally, and the whims of the body were affecting the mind. The mind resolved to correct this anomaly once it had achieved its current objective. In the meantime, it had the means to satisfy its hasty curiosity. It moved the body's hand into the black folds of the overcoat and felt its way gradually towards a particular pocket. From the pocket, the mind ordered the body to withdraw a small, broken amulet that had once been the property of some Arab trader centuries before. The mind moved away from its body and pushed itself lightly against the amulet, something analogous to walking up to a door and knocking. Feeling the mind's presence, the amulet's occupant emerged from its home. A dark, spectral shadow formed alongside the mind's body. It was vaguely humanoid and devoid of detail. The air around it cooled immediately to 10 degrees below the current air temperature, and the mind's body detected the sense of unease caused by being so close to it. "Golem Spectre, I have need of you," the mind said, not through speech, but through literally reaching its mental tendrils outwards and interfacing with the dark presence's own alien consciousness. It responded with thoughts like ice crystals. "Your will is my will. Speak it, and it shall be done." The 3 ignorants in that building. I wish to know what they're speaking about. Go and listen, and then inform me of what you have heard, the mind instructed. "As you say," it responded, and it dissolved from view. The mind turned its back to the telescope, and it could see the shadow of the Golem Spectre appearing, hovering behind Investigator Mirren. The mind could see it, but the ignorants could not. Their minds are so integrated with their bodies that they are blinded to the presence of the bodiless golems. They could, however, gain occasional glimpses of them in stressful situations, as well as detect the unnatural cold and feel a sense of unease and of being watched. The mind hoped that the Golem Spectre was being subtle and would not put the leads off their conversation. Unfortunately, it was out of range for the mind to be able to have the Spectre's experience directly relayed to itself. It had to wait for it to report back. The pang of impatience returned to the mind's body. Impatience was such a spiky sensation that it appeared to the mind as a misshapen oval with spines of various lengths sticking out of it. There was no excuse for it either. When the mind had stood its body still for 100 years, it had spent the entire time taming the Golem Spectre to make it the mind's servant. The golems only answered to their long-departed creators, and to the mind's knowledge, itself was the only thing that had ever called itself a human being that had ever won a golem's allegiance. Such a feat was not achieved with impatience. Yet now impatience tugged incessantly upon the hem of the mind's thoughts. Although the mind did not believe in miracles, it felt as if a minor one had just occurred. Mirren walked over to the window and opened it up, and the mind's sharp ears could hear a little of their speech. What was it they were saying? It almost sounded like rhyming. Were they reading poetry? How peculiar. Yet she was certain that Mirren was reading out a poem. The mind saw the shape of poetry appear in its eyeless gaze, like a luminescent jellyfish swimming gracefully through calm waters, each movement localized in one place, creating a wave that spread to the next. A shape so pliable as to almost not be solid and yet be utterly set in its dimensions. The mind disapproved of these thoughts. They caused the body to experience too many of the emotions that plague the existence of the ignorant. The reading stopped, and the mind detected the heavy presence of the Golem Spectre beside her. "What have you learned?" the mind asked, joining with the Spectre. "They are preparing to leave for the target's location," the Spectre answered. "Where is it?" the mind replied. Less than 5 minutes later, the mind commanded the body to mount its motorcycle and blaze through traffic in an attempt to reach the location of the target before Mirren and friends got there. It would be easier to eliminate him if they were not present. On the way, rain began to fall in heavy, unrelenting sheets which battered the body with cold. One defect the body had was its tendency to be cold. Cold right to the bone. That feeling always brought up something the mind despised. Partial memories of when it was an ignorant. Partial memories were shaped like a black square, which got smaller and yet somehow never fully vanished out of sight. An image materialized within the mind of a young woman in a time so long ago that iron was not yet crafted by the hands of the ignorant. The young woman stood on the steps of some sort of temple, but it was cold that day. The place was in the desert, and so she was used to the heat. But on this cold day, she was cold to the bone. She delivered her prayers and song, as was her duty. It was poetry. There it was again. Poetry. Such thoughts, thinking like the ignorant. This was unacceptable, the mind thought. Determined to purge itself of whatever ailed it as soon as was possible. But soon its purposeful attention was back to practical matters. The body stowed the motorcycle in a discreet location under some trees, and it stood up. At the mind's command, the body slipped into the trees and stiffly strode through the woods. Its chest dead straight as its legs navigated mounds and branches with surgical precision. It would seem to onlookers as if its gait were exceptionally off balance, but in truth, it was more stable on the ground than the trees were, with their roots gripping the innards of the earth itself. The body reached the other side of the small woods and looked out upon a green field. It brought the telescope up to its eye, and the mind looked for its target. In the middle of the field was a large circular mound, likely some sort of Bronze Age burial site constructed by the ancestors of the ignorant. Upon the top of the hill stood a lone figure. That had to be the target. The mind barked an order, and the body flattened itself to the ground, trying to stay hidden in the long grass. The body then moved forward, bringing its legs almost right up to its neck when moving, to stop the body from having to raise its hindquarters to crawl faster, or, crawling painfully slowly, flatten its front. With each movement, the body's leg joint snapped, and the nerves and muscles and tendons screamed. The mind disconnected itself from the body's pain signals, and so, like a grotesque forward-moving crab, the body swiftly approached the target, down low, with little to no chance of it being seen. The mind's good fortune so far came to an end when she saw Mirren and the two assistants approach on foot. An ignorant may have felt disappointment at losing the chance of a clean, collateral-free kill, but the mind coldly shifted its priorities to deal with the new situation. If it must dispose of the three to get to the one, very well. It simply needed to think more carefully about how to do it. The mind crawled up the mound, close to the target, and waited, listening and watching. Moments later, Mirren, Matthews, and Barry approached. "All right, Lloyd," Mirren said crisply in her Scottish accent. The target turned around to face her. It was a tall man, middle-aged. The mind could make out the white collar of a Catholic priest, visible through his thick overcoat. The target was confirmed. The description in its memorized briefing played through the mind's attention. Father James Lloyd, a Catholic priest, is an agent of a known clandestine Catholic agency, confirmed to be coordinating an investigation into a known cult, the Death Seekers Organization. Target's actions have disrupted some of our operations. Eliminate with extreme prejudice. Note, target may possess active relics from primordial times. Be advised. Proceed with caution. "Why is it always raining when I work with you three?" Lloyd asked in greeting as the three former police officers joined them. "It's because Mirren's such a miserable old git these days," Matthew said sarcastically. "I know who I get it from," Mirren retorted. Barry, who had never quite managed to become as desensitized to this work as the other two, stared at the center of the mound. "This is where they plan to... You know," she said quietly. "I believe so," said Lloyd. "But not this time. When those godless sinners show their faces to perform their vile ritual, this time they'll walk straight into us." The three knew that was an oblique reference to their orders. Shoot on sight, and keep shooting until they stop moving. There was no due process in this particular line of police work. The moment the cultists came over the hill, they'd be dead before they could register what was even happening. As grim as this sounded, it was a better option than always being one step behind, following their chain of grotesque ritualistic murders across the country. Barry especially felt that she could not stomach seeing another young person cut down in their prime, laid flat out on the floor, their bodies defiled with occult drawings, literally sliced into their skin. Even Barry would have no hesitation to pull the trigger when those sickos showed up. The three moved to 3 points along the edge of the hilltop, forming a triangle, so that each had a view of a third of the surrounding area. Together, they could see all of it. Like the mine's body, the three police officers crouched down to avoid being seen, and began their watch. This brought them too close to the body for the mine to be sure of remaining unseen. As such, it had to retreat a little down the hill. The body could no longer hear their hushed conversations, now taking place through radios on each of their persons. Ignorance of the target's intentions at such a moment was an unacceptable tactical disadvantage. As such, the mind reached forth and knocked upon the amulet stored in the body's pocket. Beside the body materialized the golem's dark shadow. "Be my eyes and ears," the mind commanded. "As you say," it responded and vanished. This time the spectre remained close enough that the mind could maintain a strong enough connection with it to listen to and see what it was seeing and hearing. "It really bugs me," Matthew said into the radio, "how it took us this long to figure out that dirty buggers communicated using poetry." "None of us are much into poetry," Mirren responded. "Speak for yourself," Matthews answered. "I know Shakespeare's 'I wandered lonely as a cloud' and all that." "That's Wordsworth, not Shakespeare," Barry interjected. "Same thing," Matthews responded. The mind noted how it now made sense why it had overheard them reading poetry earlier. It was a lead for them. However, once again, the remnants of old thoughts and feelings pushed their way up. That girl from long ago, singing from the temple steps, would have felt very strongly about poetry being used for nefarious ends. Ignorance truly had the most foolish of concerns. The mind forced such thoughts back into the mists of forgetfulness. "Something else has been bugging me," Matthews continued. "What now? Do you need your nappy changed?" Mirren asked. "No, thanks, Mum." "But why do these crazy cultists like these hills so much?" he asked. "They're old, I suppose. It makes them feel important," Mirren suggested. "Aye, that's the obvious answer, but it doesn't quite do it for me." "Have you got a better idea?" Barry asked Matthews. "Aye, in fact I do," he said, with a slight note of indignation in his voice. "What's with the tone of surprise?" "I'm sure it's nothing. You're such a scholar, after all. I saw you reading Romeo and Juliet by William Wordsworth last night," Mirren said, a smirk detectable in her voice. "Oh, bloody ha, Matthews responded. "Go on, son. Enlighten us," Barry said. "Well, I was thinking. These things are supposedly graves, right?" Matthews asked. "Right," said Mirren. "Well, maybe whoever's buried under here was one of them way back in the day, and these places are holy or something," he suggested. "That would mean the cult goes back to the Bronze Age," Barry commented. "Weirder things have happened," he retorted. "Well, that idea wasn't entirely daft, Matthews. You're the class's star pupil today," Mirren said. "I know I can always rely on you for compliments, Mum," he responded sarcastically. The mind processed what it was hearing and surmised that the trio must be exceptionally nervous. It knew from its studies of the topic that light banter was a common thing for soldiers or other groups ready to do something dangerous to engage in prior to action. It helped them deal with the anxiety. The ignorants were such contradictory creatures, their ways so alien to the mind that although it understood such things intellectually, it could not simulate them within its own thoughts. It was one of a myriad of ways in which the mind was superior to the ignorant. The human condition required shedding, not maintaining. And such observations only hardened the mind further into this worldview. "I think there's a problem," Father Lloyd said, his voice shaken. "What's that?" Mirren asked. The spectre's gaze turned to Lloyd. He was standing there, holding a black circle of glass, staring into it. "They've sent an unclean spirit ahead of them," he gasped, fear evident in his voice. "What now?" Matthews interrupted. "They've sent a demon to scout ahead. It's standing here among us. We can't see it with our eyes, but believe me, it's here." "This better be a joke. You know I don't like ghost talk," Matthews said. "No, this is no joke." "It means they know we're here," he said. "They could be retreating as we speak." "You can't be serious," Mirren gasped in horror. "You better check the perimeter before we lose them," Lloyd said. Mirren cursed and barked orders. The 3 former cops stood up, ran down the hill, and vanished into the rain, their weapons pointed, ready to fire at any fleeing cultists. The priest stood still, the rain dripping off the rim of his hat, and the glass circle held out in front of him. "I see you, demon," he said, staring at the black glass, which was pointed towards where the spectre stood. The priest moved forward bravely, but was evidently frightened. He brought out a crucifix and held it up. "In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, I banish you from this hill. Return to hell from whence you came." The mind was always astounded at the strength of belief the ignorant had in their superstitions. The spectre was no more concerned with the crucifix than it was with a nearby rock. Regardless of the priest's poor understanding of golems and their functions, the mind knew that its cover was blown. The other 3 were away, chasing shadows, and the priest was alone. The mind calculated this was the most opportune time to eliminate the target, rather more blatantly than it would have liked, but effectively nonetheless. The mind called the spectre back, and it vanished. The priest relaxed, evidently believing that he had successfully expelled it through the power of his faith. The mind repressed upwellings of memory that, at one point, when it was an ignorant, it too had believed comparable follies. However, now was the time for action, not reflection. The mind ordered the body to rise, which it did, silhouetted against the endless sheets of rain. It stepped forward, its stiff gait jerkily appearing over the ridge of the hill. "Screaming at shadows, Father?" the body asked, its voice robotic and broken, but recognizably female. Father Lloyd caught sight of the body's approach, let out a yelp and backed off. "Cultist!" Lloyd yelled, clearly hoping one of his armed team members was within earshot. "Why would I require a cult?" the body asked, steadily advancing on the target. Who are you?" Lloyd choked as the body came fully into view. The mind reached out and touched the priest, peering into the folds of his brain, and prodding the sections which induced fear and panic. Shaking vigorously, Lloyd lifted the glass circle and looked into it. Whatever he saw turned his fear into life-changing horror. "Witch!" he bellowed at her, whipping out his crucifix. "Stay where you are! God shall shelter me!" he screamed, pointing the icon at her. The body stopped moving. "Lie on the ground," the body commanded. "You have no power over me, servant of Satan," the priest shrieked. The mind spread itself further inside Lloyd's brain, seeking out the right nerves to touch. Finding them, the mind leaned on them, and Lloyd's legs gave way, and he landed kneeling in the muddy grass. "How did?" he gasped, utterly consumed with terror. "Monster!" he shouted, his eyes wide. The body moved forward again. It was nearly close enough to be able to complete its mission. "Your God has abandoned you," the body said, attempting to intimidate him further. "No! No!" he screamed. He started to pray vigorously, tears running down his face. "I am your God now, and you will obey me," the body said, knowing that sacrilege was the best way to break his superstitious spirit. "I will never obey a witch like—" "Strip," the body commanded. And the mind tightened its grip, now having nearly fully infected Lloyd's brain. It grabbed the parts that controlled his arms and legs, and like a puppet master, forced him into tearing off his own clothes. He stood in the rain naked. Humiliation added to his terror, weakening his already pathetic mental defenses. The body's mouth twitched at the corners, a habitual remnant from when it was an ignorant. Such expressions of emotion had long since vanished from its lived experience. The mind considered the nude priest clutching the circle of glass and noted how he looked utterly defeated, like he was already dead, feeling like his God had forsaken him, had utterly vanquished his will to go on. It concluded that he had been sufficiently weakened for the mind to terminate him. The body walked right up to the priest. "Lie down," it ordered. The mind pulled on the nerves that controlled his legs, and he fell down flat on his back in the mud, making a splash. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," Lloyd kept repeating to himself as he lay there in the rain, the body towering over him, its presence pushing him into the earth and down to the hell he so feared. In times past, when it was an ignorant, the mind might have felt some sort of pity for the crumpled shell of a creature doomed to die, begging its superstitious deity for rescue. Of all of the useless emotions that the ignorant suffered, pity had to be among the most pointless. Without further delay, the mind enclosed the last of the priest's brain in its iron tentacles. Not a single nerve fired in its chambers without the mind's approval. "Lord, have mercy on me! Mercy! Mercy!" he stuttered out. "The Lord cannot hear you, but I can. I shall show you mercy," the body said. The mind closed off the parts of his brain that generated fear and expanded those that encouraged calm. He had already been broken, and as such, it would be the mind to show mercy in a way. Irony was still something it could appreciate. It was shaped like a rugby ball, with pointy edges. A forced calm and clarity fell upon Lloyd, and he could appreciate the direness of the situation without being affected by his emotions. "Before you kill me, witch, tell me your name, so that I may speak it in heaven, so the Lord will curse you for assaulting his church," said Lloyd, his voice level and his gaze steady. Names were primitive things. The mind had not borne one in its own right for millennia. And what it was, it could not recall. But the ignorant were reliant on such things to distinguish one individual from another. As such, it had been called many things over the centuries. It decided to answer with the current favourite moniker among the ignorant. "You may call me Astoria," the body said. Then the mind wrapped itself around the part of the brain that controlled the priest's heart. The mind cradled the bundle of nerves, whispering to it and lulling it to sleep like an infant in the hands of its mother. First, it gently dimmed, and then it faded to a final quietness. Lloyd's heart stopped beating. Astoria stood over him and waited as the naked man gripped the circle of glass to his chest, his knuckles white with the tightness of their grip. His mouth moved in prayer, right up until his brain began to starve of oxygen, and he fell still. His face was frozen, in a death mask, of pious defiance. On his last breath, Astoria just about heard the words, "God forgive me." "Hey Lloyd, we didn't find anyone," a Scottish accent called from out of the rain. The three former policemen were back. Before they emerged to the top of the hill, Astoria melted into the grey sheets of falling water, as if she had never been there. By the time she had reached the bottom of the hill, she could hear the horrified screams of confusion and disbelief from the three who had just discovered the remains of the priest, who had unexpectedly gone to meet his god.